Okay, good evening, everybody. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Paula Bourne. I'm the head of the Centre for Women's Studies and Education here at OISE-UT, and I'm delighted to welcome many old friends I see here, and also the new friends who have come this evening. It is wonderful to have you here for what is the last in this year's series of the Popular Feminism and Lecture. I just want to make one announcement first. Unfortunately, we only have one copy of this, but for some of you, you may be interested to know that Bonnie Bairstow's novel, The House on Lippincott, is being launched this Thursday on the 6th floor here at OISE-UT. Sorry, 7th floor, you're right, Adult Education in the Peace Lounge at 6 o'clock, and Bonnie will be reading from her novel, and maybe I could just read a little because it may be a topic that may be of interest to many people here. It says, embedded in Canadian and world history and set in downtown Toronto between 1947 and the turn of the century, The House on Lippincott is a Jewish family saga which weaves together family caring, Holocaust trauma abuse, aging, betrayal, anti-Semitism and resistance. And Bonnie, as many of you may know, is a faculty member at OISE-UT, a feminist psychotherapist and a well-known author and activist. So that will be this Thursday at 6 o'clock. Well, tonight is a particular pleasure for me to have Frieda here giving us a preview of this amazing work that she has been doing. I was thinking, Frieda, I was saying, oh, Frieda and I have been friends and colleagues, and then I thought, no, I don't want to say have been, because we are. So I really want to emphasize the are for over 30 years. And when I first met Frieda, it was in a small office with a number of other women who were the women who were working. I would refer to it as the women's kit, though I know you'd actually moved on at that point. And I just thought, you know, that I was fairly recently here from England and had just had a child, and I found this group of women just so different from anybody I knew, and so interesting and fascinating. In fact, the first time I ran into them, well, didn't run into them, I went down to meet them, they were all sitting there watching soap operas, and I thought, soap operas, you know, in this academic institution. But as they pointed out to me, this was really a feminist art, and they were all dedicated feminists and activists, and Frieda, as you know, has continued to be such. And Frieda went on to begin the Women's Educational Resources Centre here, which started out as a couple of bookshelves in an office and morphed into this wonderful, unique collection of books, documents, reports, periodicals. And it wasn't just the collection, it was Frieda, because people would come, and I see people nodding around here who know that you would come in, you may have a question, and Frieda would quickly run around and pull things off the shelves for you. And there must be many, many people here and many students who, whose thesis topics really evolved out of the questions that Frieda would ask these people. Well, unfortunately, a merger took place here, as we all know, and so the Women's Educational Resources Centre that had been part of the Centre for Women's Studies and Education was moved into the main library here on the 2nd floor. And Frieda decided in her ultimate wisdom that the time was to move on to the next stage of her life. And the next stage of her life has been very much absorbed by what she is going to speak about tonight. And I've been privileged to have little snippets of this, as Frieda has showed me, some illustrations and photographs. And all along, I've just been waiting, dying for this evening when we can hear more about it. So without further ado, and because we all want to hear Frieda, Frieda, for you.
Very much, Paula. Do I have to speak directly into that?
Close.
Okay. I was thinking about how, if you're speaking about a time when having a home was a dream, and one is seen as a refugee life, as you know, as fleeing and not necessarily homeless in every way, but certainly a base of homelessness, that to be able to speak here at OISE, the Center for Women's Studies, which has been an intellectual and a spiritual and political home for me for, well, 25, 30 years. Paula has been my dear friend and colleague and continues to be, and we hope for many years, in whatever transformation, whatever incarnations we choose. So if you're going to be a refugee, if you're going to speak about being a refugee, this is the place to do it. You do it in a place where you feel at home. And I think that this is, you know, this is a good time for me. I want to say this is a very difficult subject for me. It has been difficult in preparing the book, has been difficult. This talk tonight is my first one, and maybe the only one, we don't know. For me to be able to articulate a topic which inherent in it. I mean, the Holocaust, we all know, doesn't need to be spoken about in any other way except the fact that it's acknowledged. But for me, it has been a time of great ambivalence. It has been a time of also great contradictions and conflict. And there's a history to it which I think made it very, very difficult. For many years, I really shunned any identity as a refugee. When I was a child, I came to America at the age of 9. The last thing on earth I wanted to do was to be chosen as a refugee. And in those days, refugees were made into little poster people. You were called up and people put you in front of an audience and they said, oh, here's a refugee girl. So for me, I learned English in 6 months just out of desperation, not to have to answer to that identity. And for many years, that really was the way I perceived it. In later years, when I matured somewhat, who knows when maturity ends, I began to feel that I don't have a right to call myself a Holocaust survivor, which I'm not. And I didn't quite know. I knew that my life had certainly been influenced, shaped, changed by the Holocaust, but I was not a survivor. I was never in a concentration camp, nor was I in hiding, nor was I in any of the forests. So that the usual association identity just didn't fit, and I felt in a sense that I mustn't tread on this ground. And so for years, I knew, of course, my life, and I knew my family's life, but I didn't call myself a Holocaust survivor. And then I began to realize that what I was a Holocaust refugee. And that, I think, is an accurate title. And so from that time on, I think I've begun to understand that identity in a way that I hadn't before. Now, that still doesn't answer the question as to why one would want to dig up memories, why one would want to return to a time which, even though it was not horrific, and by comparison it was paradisial to what other children went through during that period. Nevertheless, it isn't easy to reawaken all these memories. However, I felt a certain obligation, and I'm using that word. People use it and they misuse it, but I do think that after I've thought about it, that is the word that I have to stay with. An obligation to provide history, or to provide at least whoever it is that reads history that's interested in this period with this is an aspect of Holocaust history which is really not as well known. Certainly in the English-speaking world, it is hardly known. A chapter of Holocaust history which took place in Switzerland. And so I was particularly eager to do it because I happen to be, what can I say, it's genetic. I have a good memory. And I was in Switzerland from the ages of 5 to 9 and remember a great many things. And I will later talk about memory and confirmation of memory, which becomes a major issue when you're writing a memoir. And I felt that I was at the age, I'm 68 now, where there were very few people left who were either young enough or old enough to be able to have childhood experience. And when you're a refugee of any sort, but especially a child refugee, as opposed to, let's say, a teenage refugee or an adult refugee, you really, it's a unique perspective on refugee life because you've had nothing that you can remember before. So that discontinuity of refugee life is really the only continuity. So it's a unique moment in perception. And therefore, I felt that I was, in a sense, privileged, if one can use that word, to have been at that age with a good memory, which I inherited from my dear mother, and that I can now, in a sense, recall those events from a child's perspective. And I think that's a very important period. It's also important developmentally to have that perspective. So that was at least one aspect of it. The other motivation that I had in writing this book and working on it for so long was the question that I had, and that continues, I think, to interest me. What is life like? How is life shaped for, it turns out, I'll go into statistics later, but about 25,000 people who were saved. These were the fortunate ones who were saved in Switzerland. On the other hand, they were interned, they were refugees, they were not, there on skiing expeditions. How do they shape their life? How did they bring a community together? How did they educate their children? How did they maintain cultural life? What did they do? Did they sit out the war knowing that they were at least safe, they were no longer being hunted? Or how did they create a world? And this interested me enormously, and I think was really the main motivation, besides my own sort of, I guess, ego, as Paula said. My time, I left here and I had to find a project, or the project, found me. So these are some of the areas that, I really, there's an enormous amount of material, and I will go into at least the headlines. I want to make it also, in some way, I want to indicate this is not an autobiography. This is a memoir, which means I will be emphasizing certainly the context that all this took place in, the historical context, the social context, as much as I can. And of course, I will not be absent, so there'll be, you'll see pictures of little Frieda and all that stuff. But in the meantime, I don't want this to be seen as a particular, hymn to my own survival. Now, you'll also see that as I go along that there will be some very harsh words said about Switzerland, and many of them well-deserved. I will continue to repeat that. When I do make these statements, I wanted to really emphasize that I'm not speaking about individuals who showed, many of them, very humane, very compassionate behavior towards refugees, nor many of the organizations, including church groups. I'll go into some of that detail. When I speak about Swiss refugee policy, I'm talking about official Switzerland, the Switzerland that shaped the policy, the immigration policy, the refugee policy, not individual groups or media. In other words, there are 2 or 3 realities, which is what makes it so difficult, because on the one hand, one cannot make one statement, I can't, without having to go back and say, well, yes, but. So that constantly, there's a halting quality, because one cannot just proceed easily, both with my own feelings about, where I fit in and what I remember and what I don't remember, but also my view and perception of Switzerland. Now, most people, I think, unless they have a particular history there, have begun to associate Switzerland with the banks and the stolen gold and all that. And which is of very little interest to me, what has not been seen was that 25,000 Jews, at least, spent the war years in Switzerland, and we'll talk about the ones that didn't make it as well. So we'll start, I think, with just a little bit of an indication of where Switzerland lies in Europe. It's that little Swiss cross that you've seen on Swiss Army knives and chocolate and so on. Okay, so here you'll see that puts Switzerland in a particular position, that it became a kind of natural border for people fleeing both Germany, Austria, and when they were annexed, it was one, from Italy and from France, occupied France, so that the warring countries, the Axis countries, as well as occupied France, this was a natural place for crossing borders. And so Switzerland, in fact, became, a centerpiece for that. If you'll remember, some of your Latin, you'll remember also the mountains, which made it difficult. When Hannibal tried to cross the mountains, he didn't get very far in Switzerland. Helvetia, as it was then called. So there is the history of, the geography, rather, of Switzerland, and there's also the history. We can continue like this. I can read. Is that comfortable for people, the dim lights? Or the? Okay, whatever. Okay, doesn't matter. All right. Now, Switzerland, in addition to having this particular centrality, this landlocked quality, and surrounded by all these countries, Switzerland also had a history, beginning with the 19th century, of an asylum giver, a haven, a humanitarian, a country concerned with humanitarian issues. Now, this was always conditional. It wasn't really quite the open arm that one assigns to such words as asylum. There were always the good refugees and ones that weren't so welcome. But be that as it may, it was that kind of reputation Switzerland had. And Switzerland also had a reputation for being a neutral country. So we see that beginning with, that there were certainly aspects of Swiss refugee haven that we can understand. However, as much as Switzerland was a haven, as much as it was a country that saw itself as being a humanitarian receptor, on the other hand, it was also a country that had a history of fear of, the Germans call it Überfremdung, fear of influence of foreigners. And in the case of Jews, it became Überjudung, fear of influence of Jews. And so what you had is, at the same time that you have this sort of neutrality, so to speak, we'll talk about that in a minute, you also had layers of anti-Semitism. And Switzerland, was not guilt-free in that. And the Jewish population in Switzerland was only 18,000, so they were a small minority, a beleaguered minority that had not even been allowed in Switzerland until, I think, the early 19th century in certain parts. And then they were segregated. So there was never a welcoming of Jews. However, they were a modest group, and I think they kept things reasonably quiet. So what we see now is, so there is the country, the geography, which makes it, a place that fleeing Jews are trying to cross into Switzerland, and at the same time you have the conditions that exist. One of the things that happened in 1938. Is this clear? Yeah. Okay. This is the ignominious, the villainous, the J on the passport. You see the J, and then you see the swastika. In 1938, Austria and Germany annexed Austria, much to the glee of the Austrians. It wasn't an occupation. It was, a happy, well, not a reunion, but a happy union. At that time, many Jews, including my parents, and after the Anschluss, after Kristallnacht, 38 was a year that many Jews realized that to live in Germany and Austria was not such a, was not a good idea, and if you could escape, this would be the time to do it. Now, the Swiss were not unaware of this possibility of floods of Jews coming to Switzerland, and this is something that they wanted to avoid. And as one of the ministers of immigration and refugee affairs said, that they wanted to prevent anti-Semitism in Switzerland by not letting too many Jews in, that this would prevent it from really getting out of hand. So the J passport, which is really an ignominious moment in Jewish history and in Swiss history and in all European history, this was put on the passport of German Austrian Jews, and now Germany and Austria were one, which meant a large number of Jews had this put on their passport, which meant that Switzerland. Which meant, first of all, that they would be denied entry to many other countries, not only to Switzerland. But this was instigated by Switzerland. It was not the Nazis that instigated it. It's a controversial question. I've read a great deal about it. But most people seem to agree that this was really Switzerland's inspiration, so to speak, and that they asked them to do that so that they, at the borders, that they would be able to know to whom to issue visas and to whom not to issue visas. A J passport was a guarantee that you would not get a visa. So that all the Jews that came into Switzerland from about 1942, there are generalizations that we have to use on at these times, were illegal. They were illegal refugees, which meant that they did not cross with a visa. And in addition to that, we also have, because of the anti-Semitism, Jews were explicitly mentioned as not being allowed into Switzerland for racial reasons, so that we have a situation where you have thousands of Jews fleeing occupied France by 42, which is where my family came from, Switzerland, Germany, Austria and Germany already for a number of years before, and racial reasons, racial discrimination, racial oppression was not considered a political issue. So therefore, Jews were explicitly, and actually in the orders that were given to border guards, they were told not to allow Jews in for racial reasons, and they were not allowed political status, which meant that even if you had a Jew who may have been a political refugee, he or she would not have been allowed entry under that aegis if the J was on their passport, and it was on all the Jewish passports. So the J stamp not only prevented them from entering Switzerland, but also from other countries where they might have found some safety. Now, at this time in 1942, but even before that, in 41 and so, Switzerland knew what was going on in terms of the murder of Jews. The Swiss had embassies throughout the world. They had consuls. The money flowed back and forth. The flow of capital never stopped. The flow of refugees did. But flow of capital went on through all the years of the war. And Switzerland knew what was happening. Riegner, who was the head of the Jewish Congress, sent a cable to Switzerland and to other countries telling them about the plans to exterminate the Jews. And so that the reason for, in other words, Switzerland is particularly guilty because they knew so early on and they knew so well. Now, this is not to say that average citizens, the press was heavily censored too, that the average citizen knew what was going on, but certainly government and diplomatic corps knew everything that was going on. And the Swiss not only knew about the murder of the Jews, but they closed the borders during the most catastrophic times, 42, 43. And they made some exceptions because of the outcry of citizens, particularly church people. There were some very, very compassionate and very, very dedicated church workers and church members who really deplored the draconian measures at the border, and they knew what that meant. And so that, and the media also, the progressive media, I'm not talking about, the ones who were, I'll show you the National Front, which was the Nazi-supported media, they protested the border closings, and so that for a while the sanctions were lifted, things were a little bit easier at the border. Nevertheless, it wasn't until 1944, when so many Jews had been murdered, that in fact the Swiss removed the non-racial law and removed the non-political law, so that by 1944 they allowed anyone, the borders were open when it was already too late for so many millions. Now, what happened during this period, when they did make I don't know if any of you have seen the film The Boat is Full. It's a very wonderful film about exactly this Swiss policy. The exceptions around September 26, 1942, which is exactly the day that my family and I crossed the border, there was some new legislations issued, and that legislation, border legislation, focused on some of the exceptions. First of all, it said no, illegal Jews are not allowed. I mean, however, there are exceptions. Families with children under 16, children whose ages are under 16, also the elderly and the ill and the infirm. Now, what happened as a result of that was the issue of instant families. And this becomes something that appears over and over again. In this film, which is a wonderful film, the man was made into a pariah as a result of exposing this crime, the crime of the Swiss, not the crime of the people who formed instant families. But one of the people I met who was a camp director, one of the refugee camps in Switzerland, describes how he knew that there were two sisters, one of whom had 2 children and one who didn't have children. The one who didn't have children would have been turned back at the border. And when we say turned back, or as the French call it, refoulement, that meant pretty certain death. So what they did is they gave 1 child to each sister, and that's a lot of families did that if they could. In other words, if you didn't, if you could get away with it. The idea was that you had a chance, at least, at that point. And so he describes how they were how he tried to bring them together so that they would be able to have their holidays at the same time and see their children. Now, let's see what else. Now, let me give you a few of the figures. Oh, before we go into the anti-Semitism that I've talked about, over here, this is the National Front. Which was a Nazi supported the Nazis, and what it says essentially is Zurich. This came out in 1938. Is Zurich already Jewish? And they say for a consistent policy, vote for a consistent national and social politic, vote for the National Front, which is opposed to citizenship for Jews, Freemasons, and the Red Party. Jews were linked continually with communism. And over here, I don't know if you can see it, they talk about a strike in 1918, which apparently was, really countrywide and disabled, and there's a Jewish star. So the Jews were the ones who instigated this national strike in 1918. What they also did is you have over here Jewish, wait, I can point to it here, does that work?
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's perfect. Oh, technology is wonderful. Okay, so this is, this speaks about Jewish, the high financing. So Jews, you can see, as this still is happening today, unfortunately. They control the press, they control theater, they control cabaret films, and all those things. So the Jews are both instigators for strikes, but they also control the wealth which they put to use. And then they also, and the Reds are responsible for strikes, for unemployment. So that's, one particular expression of anti-Semitism in the National Front, which it wasn't all that popular. On the other hand, it did survive. Now, I'm jumping around a little bit because I know you're not linear thinkers, so we can just, yeah. This is a cartoon. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. This is a cartoon that was drawn by one of the internees. By 1944, there was actually a newspaper put out by refugees. All the camps contributed to it all. And of course, we have to realize that in Switzerland at that time, during those years, we had the whole range of humanity. You had, from tailors, seamstresses, to doctors, lawyers, artists, theater people, musicians by the hundreds, and certainly artists. So this was put out in this magazine. This was a monthly. It was called Über die Grenzen, Over the Borders. And so this one, I don't know if you can't see the small print, but the small print says essentially, the policeman is pointing to it, and he tells him that this is in Lucerne, and it says that the gardens around the quay of Lucerne are forbidden to refugees. So he's arrested, he goes to prison, and he dreams, and you can see the dream developing, and eventually he becomes a dog. And he's let out of jail, and over here he's perfectly happy and perfectly free to go to go to the park, because dogs are allowed but Jews aren't. And that was, by the way, this is factual. There were many places in Switzerland where they specifically said Jews are not allowed to be here. They're not allowed to use the facilities. Here's another one which comes from the same source, from Über die Grenzen, from the okay, I'll read you is this okay? All right, Helvetia, once again, if you remember your Latin, that's the old name for Switzerland. And this is what it says in the caption says, Helvetia says, "I'm so happy and so proud to have you all with me." And you can tell certainly the expression how happy she is and how proud she is to have all these refugees in her country. So that, these were some of the manifestations of anti-Semitism. And now the statistics, which I'd like to just get to a little bit. Statistics, as always, have to be treated with caution. In this particular case, extra caution, because the numbers are based on, to some degree, records that are being kept. Now, not all records were kept. As you know, the Swiss were very good at keeping records, and more of that later. But on the other hand, we know that about 25,000 Jews were admitted. And even that, some people say it's closer to 30, some say it's 21, but give or take that. That's the figure that is accepted. Now, the figure that has been documented of Jews that were turned back at the border, refoulement. These are Jews who were turned back and handed over to the Germans, or if they weren't handed over, they were not allowed in, which amounted to the same thing. That we have about the same number, to almost 25,000 that were documented, that were actually written. Now, we know that many Jews were turned back and there was no documentation. Moreover, we also know that there were Jews who never even tried any longer because there was no point. They realized what was happening. So that in fact, it's a pretty grim, it's a pretty awful picture. Altogether, Switzerland took in during the war years 300,000 refugees, but that included deserters who had no trouble getting in. All they had to do, a deserter only had to show a little, this is in the documentation, a tiny fragment of a uniform. That was enough to qualify you as a deserter, and that's fine. I mean, deserters should be given sanctuary. A Jew, of course, didn't have such privileges, and prisoners of war. So that the figure was always kept that Jews were never allowed to go beyond the 10% reception. Even that is not even quite 10%, but it never rose. Now, Jews were the only ones who faced certain death. A deserter too, but of course a deserter could go back to a country and maybe speak the language and so on. Where could Jews go? There was no other place. So when we talk about rejection, it's not the same for other groups. This was absolutely, it meant death, almost certain death. Now, what I'd like to show a little bit, so some of us, I'll go into my own story in a little while, but those Jews that were fortunate enough to cross into Switzerland illegally, and the people I've interviewed, generally the story is very, very similar. It's illegal, it's at night. Usually you have a passeur, from the French, guide. If you're lucky, the guide is, decent and honest and does what he or she can. In some cases, guides were not so generous, and they might have taken money, but would not have necessarily brought you to the place that was then safe, and there was nothing you could do. So those Jews that did cross the border, and as I said, so many of the stories are about Jews the rain. I remember the night that we came, and it's interesting how many of the refugees that I've interviewed, former refugees, have the same story. They remember rain, they remember the darkness, and they remember dogs, the barking and howling of dogs. So we and, the other thousands that got in were then brought into a reception camp, which once again was mostly a military camp, and from there people were dispersed to various parts of Switzerland. And there were many, many different kinds of camps. There were camps that were essentially for men, which were work camps. And the men, I don't have an overhead, I forgot to make it. The men were forced to go into labor camps. And once again, I don't think that's such a terrible thing, but they, it wasn't, wasn't their choice by any means, but that was acceptable, I think, in a certain way. They were allowed to have they got some recompense, but very, very little. And so what happened at this time, and once again, I'll come to that a little bit later, there was separation of husbands and wives, parents and children. This became a major issue in Switzerland. But at this point, let me just mention some of the camps. So you had camps that had, this was some of the typical workshops. No one was ever idle in these camps. So you were either learning, towards the end of the war, there was a real effort to train people. Partly it was done because it made good sense to train people for, life after the war, but also it made them more likely to be absorbed by other countries. And by the end of the war, the Swiss really wanted people to leave, and that was, certainly as much a motivation as anything else. Here's another. So that as you can see, most of the professions were very much, they were all segregated. Women were taught, sewing, home work, laundry and so on, and men were taught, the more male accepted jobs. But men, so that men were in the work camps, they cut trees, they cleared forests, they planted and so on. And women were in the camps with other women and were also expected to do work, and the work that they were expected to do was generally sewing, darning, mending for the army, the Swiss army. And the Swiss army, it was full mobilization of all Swiss citizens, so that in fact this was a very necessary work that they provided. And here's also lessons that it was a great emphasis on learning. And as you can tell, I don't know if you can you all see? Yeah, okay, so this was, clearly a very, they were very industrious, and these are all people who would have worked during the day, and at night still, classes were there. I'll go into some of the other aspects of camp life. Okay. Now, children were frequently sent to foster homes, which became, I'll get to the section on separation, but just when you see the camps, you'll see, in some occasions you'll see children, others you won't see children, because they had been sent to foster homes, which became an issue where family life was considered. This is an interesting feminist issue, because what prevailed was the thought, and it was a very strong conviction, that children are best off with families. Now the question is, if the family is so good, why couldn't they have been kept with their own family? But it wasn't to be. So the children were sent to foster homes in great many numbers. And also, anyway, I'm jumping around a little bit too much, so let me slow down a bit. Here you'll see this would have been a typical workshop to provide, the necessary work and materials for the army and for the other camps. Now, the camp that we were sent to was a place which which camp you were sent to, by the way, was a matter of luck. And it's hard to know. We were in the French part. And the French part, for most, I guess you could make that generalization. I think it's yeah, you can see the number 1 is where the children slept, and number 4 is where the parents were. The French part tended to be more sympathetic to the refugees. There are exceptions to everything that I'm saying, but generally speaking, they were more aligned with the Allies than they were with, in this German-speaking part of Switzerland, you had more sympathy. Once again, great many exceptions, with the Nazis and the Germans and so on. So that partly my mother and I, were very, very fortunate that we were sent to this Camp Morjan. My father was sent to a work camp in Sierre, which is also, it was also in the Valesian Alps. What you see are the Valesian Alps. And this particular village was, before the war, a British ski resort. Really, very much a British, resort for the rich. And in 1943, which is when we arrived at this camp, the how should we put it? Vacations were not very popular, and resorts were not being filled. So many of the hotels, and of course the Swiss are the hoteliers of the world, as you probably know, many of the hotels were turned into refugee camps. And one of the people that I interviewed was given this job of going around and finding hotels where the Jews, not only Jews, but mostly Jews at this point, where the refugees could be housed for the remainder of the war. So this is where we were, and we were extremely lucky. It is a very beautiful place. And I have to say that every time I speak about it, it's very difficult for me, because in a sense this was a paradise. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, my association is very strong with the children and the others who didn't cross the border. So it puts me in a very difficult position, but let me also not avoid this altogether. So this was the camp. This was an Orthodox camp, so Orthodox Jewish, which had a certain, first of all, it meant that the children's education was very, very central. Now, this is not true of all camps, but it certainly was true of this one. And it was also what became an integrated camp, so that the education was, the language of instruction was French, but we also learned Hebrew. But because of the Jewish influence and the Jewish ethos, we led a very integrated life, so that we ended up, having not only lessons and classes, but also holidays. And I remember so vividly, for instance, for Sukkot, the Festival of Huts, which comes in the fall, decorating this little hut with, wonderful, arts and crafts, so that our lives were really integrated, and we were, in many ways, extremely well educated. So we were a small, a closed community. There were about 400 people. Eventually, my father joined us after 9 months of being in that work camp. He joined us, and so we were, my brother at this point, I should mention, was a teenager. My parents believed in spacing, so he was, I was 5 and he was 16, and he was sent to a hakshara, which was a training camp for young people to eventually go to what was then Palestine. And they were educated in farming and gardening. In other words, the idea was to prepare them for a life as settlers and citizens of Palestine. And so this is where, you know, we lived. And I'll show you another picture. This is my father, who was always a wonderful cook. Before the war, had owned a delicatessen in Vienna. He worked in the kitchen. And that's my father. He's pouring the coffee. And you can tell they were a pretty jolly lot. I mean, they had fun. Kitchen staff usually does, I mean, if conditions are reasonable. So this was my father's contribution. And he was a wonderful cook. He could make magic out of the most modest ingredients. He made them into wonderful, wonderful, really delicacies. So that's one picture. So this is all these pictures so far are in this Camp Morgin. This is a wonderful picture which, when the book, notice I say when, not if, when the book comes out, I think this is going to be the cover. This is also because each picture tells its own story. I can't go into all of them because I've got a lot more to touch on. This was a time when a social worker was sent from Geneva. Morgin was about 2 hours from Geneva, 2-3 hours, but a very, very, actually dangerous route where you kept getting higher and higher. And periodically social workers would come to the camp, or teachers, people, I think, essentially to civilize us. We were quite a wild lot. And this particular social worker took a real fancy to our little group, and she sort of organized us into we built a hut into a little construction gang. And so here we were. This is sort of the celebration of having the lichens are in our hands, the tools of our work. And we had just finished building this, and she took this photograph. So I think it's, you know, to me it's extremely dear. I can't imagine, you know. Sorry? Sorry? Oh, well, yeah, I'm the only girl. Okay, and this is a little feminist note, which I have to say. In Morgin, in this camp, my friends were all the boys. I did not get along with the girls, which is my little sisterhood then somehow wasn't in the shape that it should have been. And I don't know why, but I just felt much more at home. I was quite a sloppy child, and my mother, bless her, was not someone who could make corrections in that area. So I never looked very neat, and the girls were, you can even tell here, I mean, here am I, centerpiece, which is not the way I remember myself at all. I thought of myself as a little bit more withdrawn, but clearly I wasn't, and all the evidence is that I'm not withdrawn. But so in this picture, you know, so either I knew the photographer or something, but this is a typical, you know, here we are with our counselors, and you know, really quite, we're performing, you know, we're clearly we're very conscious of who we are, and I wish I could meet some of these people, but, you know, doesn't look like it. And here's one more picture where, I think this is a picture probably that was taken when I first arrived, real gussied up, and one of the rare occasions I'm actually looking quite neat, you know, and so on. So this is, and you know, the camp, of course, had photographers. There were people who were photographers before the war. It had jewelry makers. There was one man who went around the camp and made wonderful jewelry for people out of wood. So, I mean, we were, in a sense, enriched by this range of humanity, by people, you know, having the possibility of all this, you know, wonderful riches. Now here are some other pictures that I found in the Swiss archives. When I speak about my research project, you'll see. These are pictures that I found that were there, and I chose them because they're very typical pictures. So this would have also been an Orthodox camp. You could tell the man is wearing a, you know, skull cap, and the children are studying, it looks like Hebrew. I mean, the books. So that's a typical scene. Another scene from the camps. These are all refugee camps. Here is nighttime, which was always very chaotic. And each night there would be a mother on duty, or mother or two on duty, and getting the children ready. And it was quite traumatic. Bedwetting was a real epidemic. I've read psychologists' report. And apparently, you know, children, it just went through all the camps. The children slept, this was very much like kibbutz style. So the children slept in the dormitories, as Mark pointed out at the beginning. And they saw that, I mean, clearly the parents are there to see them, you know, to tuck them in and so on. But generally speaking, they slept in dormitories. And I think for many children, having already witnessed a great many traumas, this was not, you know, it was not an easy time for them. Let me just see, here's another. Mealtime was also. These pictures that I'm showing you here really are very, very close to the picture, the life that I remember, that I experienced. last one of the camps. All right, now, let me just see, yeah. My own, journey, just to sort of tell you how, I was born in Vienna, and my parents had lived there from the time they were married, had a delicatessen grocery store, and were really quite comfortable. And then, with the Anschluss, I think, they did what, they were quite right, I think, in leaving. And we then fled from Austria, from Vienna, to Belgium, to Brussels. And from there, when Belgium was occupied in 1940, we then fled to France, not all of which was at that time yet occupied. And we lived in Lyon. And from Lyon, we actually crossed the border to a spot, Annemasse, not far from Geneva. So that's, the little picture there. Now, okay, I'm just looking to see if I'm missing anything. When it became clear that children would not be allowed to stay with their mothers, this was the separation issue, which didn't have to happen. I'll read you some of the statements if I can see. The call went out to, it's addressed to you, Jewish wife, Jewish woman and wife and Jewish mother. Jewish wife and mother is really what it is. In the name of thousands of refugee children in the greatest need, help us. 1,000 children await your yes, and help us. We, fortunate ones in Switzerland, want to save that remnant that hasn't been, that hasn't been destroyed by a brutal world. And at least one child, we appeal to you that at least one child should be taken in a Jewish home. We appeal to your Jewish heart and to you, help. So the call went out to all the Jewish organizations and Jewish newspapers to open up the doors to refugee children. Now this came at a time when the Jewish community was quite weak and really had very little influence. So that what would have been ideal would have been not to separate families. And indeed it wasn't necessary to do that. It really wasn't at all. They could have organized it in different ways, but this was considered, it was the expedient way. It was also a bit cheaper. So unfortunately, there were not enough homes, Jewish homes, for Jewish children. And the result was that many children were placed in non-Jewish homes, which are the and so that many of them were totally deracinated. They lost their identity as young Jews. And so that it became, I'm going to read you one statement that came out from a church group that saw this as a terrible, terrible act. And so we have here in this instance that, yes, it's true, the children were saved. In some cases, the parents were saved. Many of them already the fathers had been deported. So we had many mothers and children only. And when the call goes out, somehow it's not answered by sufficient number of homes. Don't forget, there are only 18,000 Jews. That's Jews altogether, it includes children, in Switzerland at that time, and 25,000 Jewish refugees. So, to absorb that community would have been an enormous, and this is not to say that the Jewish community was in any way passive, quite the contrary, they were extremely active, but they also had to fight on so many fronts. One of them being that they had to make sure that there would be, maybe the borders would be opened, that there could be some way of saving Jews where it was actually a matter of life and death. They also felt totally powerless in this struggle, because it was so clear that the Red Cross wanted this separation and that the Children's Immigrant Aid. And so we have, in my research, I found the documents, the papers, the minutes of the meetings of these very devoted women. They were, well, I'll come to a women's section, but the whole refugee world, the women were the linchpin in the refugee welfare work. Women took care of every single need that Jewish children had, especially children. They were very, very involved in every aspect of their life, from placement, from food, clothing, proper diet, to Jewish holidays, making sure that every child received a Hanukkah present or that matzahs were given at the right time. So they were extremely, how can I say, they were dedicated. However, the dedication, also the Jewish groups were really helpless. The secular Children's Aid, they felt that there was nothing wrong. So one of the minutes, they were discussing at what age could you separate a mother and child. So one of them said 4 years old, she thought was, this woman, Nettie Sutro, who was revered, she thought 4 years old was okay, that you could separate children from their mothers at the age of 4. And then another one says, well, why wait till 4? She said, even a 2-year-old, she said, would not suffer the separation from the mother. And then somebody says, if it were not possible, she asks if it wouldn't be possible to establish a special reception camp for mothers and babies. And then one of them says that, children should not be placed together with their mothers in work camps. Now, of course, later on it became clear that you could have, arranged so that the camps wouldn't be far. They could have had little creches. But then Sutro, who is their, revered person, she says that as long as the military reception camps remain, this is quote, mothers and children should be separated, but not too far from one another. If later on free places in private families are found for the children, then parents should not be allowed to visit their children too often. You'll see, she wants to free the children from the reception camps as soon as possible and to temporarily intern them in an already established children's reception camp or with private families. When these bulletins first came out, when these, well, we can't call they weren't legislation, they were organizations, but this is what determined the life of children and mothers. Children were allowed 3 times a year visits. No, 4 times a year, every 3 months. And apparently the scenes when the mothers had to return their children to the foster home was so heartbreaking and so hysterical. I mean, we're talking about a traumatized population already, many of whom has seen everyone. You'll see what this church group writes. And so that they decided, well, this may be, so they lessened it to every 6 weeks. Now, Switzerland's a very small country. You can get from one end to the other very quickly. There was no reason to enforce this brutality so that children can see each other. So they decided at one point that the parting scenes when the mothers returned the children were so heartbreaking and so difficult to witness that they had to find a different place. So what did they come up with? They said, we will find little weekend homes. And so they found places where the mothers and children could spend the weekend, but they didn't have to face the ordeal of returning them to the foster home. So that was their thing. But this letter, which is I think, very indicative of the fact that not everyone agreed with these draconian policies and with these heartless brutalities. So now over here, there was a Jewish weekly in Switzerland, which just up until recently was still publishing. It was 100 years old. It was called the Israelitische Wochenblatt. Oh, thank you. Okay, and that was Switzerland's weekly newspaper. And regularly, this newspaper reflected the life of Jewish refugees. They had a column which appeared every single week, and it was called From the Camps. And so at this point, in the lead article of November 27, 1942, so this is the height of, of the war, it's the height of refugee fleeing, and at this point, people are being dispersed to various camps. So this issue, the lead article, was an open letter, identified only as coming from a highly placed church source. The unnamed Christian author noted that refugee aid organizations, particularly Swiss women's groups and the Red Cross Children's Aid, morphed Red Cross, had a lot of blood on his hand, were planning to separate children from their mothers, placing them in children's camps or with private families. Granting that as presently managed, conditions in most reception camps were especially deplorable for children, it was nonetheless apparent that the emotional needs of refugee mothers were not being considered. Quote, so this is the quote, direct quote. Nothing is left to them but their children, separated from their deported relatives, from friends, from their homes, their possessions and freedom. And at present, some are far from their husbands, meaning the husbands may be working in a camp across Switzerland. We must not take from them this last and most treasured thing. End of quote. Continuing, the writer indicated the separation might last years and, quote, do we have the right to rob a mother who has already endured such hardships of her natural obligations and duties, leaving her to the emptiness and callousness of the camps? Let it not be said it is necessary for technical reasons. Love must be stronger than technical difficulties. And if love is genuine, there's always a way to be found. The greatest care must be given to act in the best interest of the child. A real mother cannot be replaced by a children's home, nor can childhood years away from mother ever be recaptured. Now, listen to this. The author referred to one transit camp where a Montessori teacher directed the kindergarten and refugee women staffed the children's kitchen, thereby benefiting both mothers and children. Elementary classes, continues, could be arranged if children were denied entry to local public schools, which they were, and could be staffed by teachers from the community of refugees who longed to engage in their profession. And it ends, wrenching children from their mothers seems an inhumanity undertaken in the name of humanity. Enough has already been torn asunder. That which still holds must be sacred to us. So this is coming from a church group, and the churches were very instrumental in doing many, many good things, from very immediate help to kind of principled actions and so on. So these were some of the, all right, now, let me just see where I'm going. All right. Now, as I have to keep saying, I was extremely lucky because I was never separated from my mother. I mean, I was in Morzin with my mother, and my father eventually joined us. And so that the conditions that I experienced, even though some of them, I still remember certain separations, and some of it still haunts me to today, was nothing compared to what so many other children went through. We're running late. Okay, let me run through, because I'd like to have discussion. I'd like to have, comments, interaction. So let me just go a little bit more. I'll do a few more things, and then I'll return to some, maybe some readings from the memoir itself, if I have time. I want to talk a little bit about women's role and the whole reading the refugee years as a feminist. We see everywhere, once we're alerted to it, we see, first of all, that women are central in refugee work. Without them, nothing would have happened. And they were industrious, they were hardworking, many of them were imaginative. I disagree with, and I'm not the only one, I think that the placement of children was a terrible thing that they did. But I think they did it out of conviction that children are better off in families. Now, that's not true. Actually, children suffered much more with these families than they would have if they had those children that were orphaned, and they were orphan children. Those children could have been placed in children's homes, and they would, with counselors who loved them. And some of them were. They were documentation of children who grew up, whose entire, childhood was spent in these homes. And they were loved, and therefore these children did not suffer the same deprivation as children in foster homes. But anyway, it's a disputed territory. Women's groups, not only were they so central in refugee work, but they also were central politically. The Women's Democratic League, which these are groups that, first of all, you have to remember, women disenfranchised in Switzerland, they didn't get the vote till 1971. I think Yemen gave women the vote before that. So here we have a group of women who are very hardworking, very, very, committed, politically very sophisticated. The Women Teachers Group that I did some research in the Women's Movement archives there, they were already in the 1930s, when very few people were talking about that. They recognized fascism, and they talked about it. They were instrumental, the teachers group, in getting children's colonies for the summer. And so that you have, really, and they work together very beautifully. It was sisterhood in action, and when you read that, it's heartening to think that, in fact, women played such a major role. Now, in other typical, if we read it once again as a feminist, we also see that all the vocational training, which became quite an urgent issue when the end of the war came. And of course, we have to remember that once it became clear the Allies were winning, Switzerland changed its tune, because as one man said, we don't know, some of the refugees may be leaders in the countries after the war, where they return, and they may not feel so well disposed towards Switzerland. So there's this action, and that includes training programs, so that women are, once again, very straightforward. Corsetterie was a big one. Seamstressing, domestic work was very, very big, because they wanted to train all these women who could go into domestic work. Now, women, young women, let's say, were also denied university education in most cases, whereas boys, young men who showed promise were allowed. So that in fact, what's her name? Ruth Westheimer, who's Dr. Ruth, you know her, right? Okay. She describes how she left in '38, never saw her parents again. I mean, this is not an atypical story. And she ends up in a youth camp. And she wants to be a kindergarten teacher. Very, very, very committed to working with children, because she had done that before. And she was not allowed to do that until she took a domestic training course. This is in her autobiography. In other words, that was a precondition. She couldn't even become a teacher. They wanted all women to be domestic workers on some level. Anyway, that was the... So we see a lot, that being a woman did have a great many implications. The major refugee and immigrant societies were headed by women, and these women were heroic. I mean, there's nothing short of that. They took on the entire government at certain times when they found that the children's lives were in danger, and they worked tirelessly. What can one say? Now, what's interesting is that the Jewish Women's Organization, that had been charity groups where they met, for work for the poor, and Jewish women used to sew their shrouds. And so they would, their own and other people. So here are women who were, leading very traditional Jewish lives, caring for the poor, for the ill, preparing for their ultimate, move to the next world. And here comes, and all of this is abandoned now in favor of refugee work. Everything stops. And as one social worker that I interviewed in Zurich, she said what happened was that kind of work became professionalized, and the whole profession of social work really benefited from that. And so these women who are now being hurled into this kind of work are asking the various organizations to give them skills. They say that we really want to know how to run meetings. We want to know how to take notes. We want to know how to do an agenda. We're doing things, but we don't have the training or the skill, and we would like to do that. So they turn to one of the, one of the administrators in the Jewish organization. She, of course, is all in favor. She brings this request to the male head of the entire umbrella of Jewish organizations, and he, unfortunately, says, well, Jewish women, he said, don't have time for this kind of luxury to learn skills. So, however, she was not a pushover, this woman, and regardless of what he said, these women got the courses. So they spent, and it's wonderful to see the records. They take this course, it's a whole weekend or a few days, and they learn these skills, and they become more effective. And they write letters to her, thanking her, for having organized this for them, and indicating how much more effective they feel. So this was really a wonderful, wonderful moment for women. So, there was some drawback, and not till 1971 did women, and they had a strong suffrage association. Women teachers were organized. I mean, it was not for lack of, of wanting or caring. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about my research, and then I think, okay, so when I became interested in this particular topic, which has been part of my life, if not most of my life, I was fortunate enough, one of my dear friends, Erica Simmons, who's here tonight, advised me to apply for a grant to the Memorial Jewish Foundation, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, which I did. And they were generous. They gave me a few $1,000s with which I could go to Switzerland. Now, I have to say, at the time, had I not gotten this grant, I think I would not have gone. Had I not gone, this would not be a book. So this, and what can I say? Luck played a role in this, and I'm forever, ever grateful. So I went to Switzerland, and looked at the various archives, and the Swiss archives are divided up between the federal archives that are in Bern, and those have the materials for all the organizations. Zurich, however, had all the Jewish stuff. And I was very lucky. This is all sort of chance. I was hosted by a wonderful woman who had been my cousin's foster mother during the war. Erica Gideon's her name, and she was, very, very gracious and very hospitable, and made my stay there really a joy. When I went into the archives, I found all the Swiss, in some ways, are like the Germans. They're very meticulous about keeping records, and they kept every single record. There are records that I found from my family, whereby, this is just a little side note, but it's interesting. My mother had a very bad case of varicose veins, and she had to have surgical stocking. 10 memos went back and forth between one organization and another, requesting that she be given these surgical stockings. And of course, the mail in Switzerland, there were 3 deliveries a day. So it went back and forth. You could write a memo, and the next day it was there. So a lot of mail was generated. So these particular archives, the one in Zurich, were just splendid. They were superb. And they reminded me a little bit of our setting. It was warm and homey and informal but rigorous, the best of everything. And once I described my project, they were quite enthusiastic. It took a little while, but, I came each day. I was very dutiful. I was not going to waste even a day. And at 9:15, I was always there. Well, one day, one of the archivists, whose name at the moment escapes me, but she was a wonderful help to me, came around. She said she thought that I should stop looking at so many papers, although I think papers have life, but she didn't. She said, I'd like to introduce you to some real people who were actually working in Switzerland during the war with refugees. So who would refuse? So she said, I'm going to introduce you to this one man. I'll call him up. His name is Samuel Jean Richard. And he was a camp administrator, and then was seconded to become the head of all education programs for a certain part of Switzerland. And he's 90 years old, and I will make the arrangements. So when she called him, and then I spoke to him, and of course I offered to go and see him. He lived in a suburb about an hour out of Zurich. Oh no, he said, absolutely not. I'm coming to the archives. I'm going to meet you there. So it was fine. I spoke German. My German is pretty good, and it got better, of course, as I went along. So we meet, and he walks through the door, and I expect he's 90, to be somewhat febrile, but he was a very sturdy-looking man. He looked like 60, long hair, earring, a shoulder bag, really hippie elegant, very, very hip and very elegant. And we had a great time. We hit it off, and it was just wonderful. And as I was about to leave, he had, early in the day, one of the archivists showed me a book that had just been published that year, children's drawings. Refugee Children's Drawings. It's a magnificent book, which I should have brought, but I forgot. Anyway, we can make arrangements later if you want. In this book, these were the drawings that were collected during an exhibit. Follow me a little bit. In 1945, after the war, the Swiss became very self-conscious of the image in the world. They had a real PR problem, and so what they and this is not my interpretation. This is actually the way it's been described. And so they wanted to, in a sense, ingratiate themselves into the world, and they had a week. Which was called the study week of the refugee child, war-injured child it was called, war-injured or war-damaged, you can decide what you want. And during that week they had a lot of children in refugee camps drawing pictures. It was a form of art therapy and a diagnostic tool as well. So they went around to a lot of the camps, and this one man, Renaud is his name, he did his master's thesis on these drawings and on this particular study of refugee children as exhibited in the drawings. So each drawing had, in addition to, I'll show you the pictures in a minute, it also had a kind of biographical sketch and the impression of the social worker or the caseworker or the kindergarten teacher, whoever was, there at that time. So I had seen this book, and my drawing was not in it. And I'd never, I just thought, well, that's life. So, but children from my camp were in it, and these were children that I knew. And this man, Samuel Jean Richard, he knew some of them also, so we were able to talk about so-and-so and so-and-so. Anyway, as I'm leaving, he asked whether I had recalled ever participating in this drawing program. And I said, no. And that was it. We parted friends and so on and so on. The next day, I'm back at the archives at 9:15. One of the young archivists, who were terrific, rushes over to me and he says, Samuel Jean Richard just called, and he gave us the number of your file and the drawing, and here it is. Okay, so usually tears come to people's eyes, not to mine, unfortunately. I can't respond that well, but yeah. Okay, so this is the drawing, and of course he ran across the street immediately to make copies for me because the original stays in the archives. So this is, Frieda Joel is 7 years old and so on. Now, I was thrilled. I saw this. I thought, my God, this is a picture of, this looks like I grew up in a suburb somewhere, a happy house and so on. So when I brought it home to my daughter, who is a psychologist and art therapist, I showed it to her and I said, look, isn't this wonderful? I mean, look, it's wartime, and she said, not so fast. It's not such a glowing picture. You didn't grow up in Long Island. I mean, this is, she said, look at the tree, the no leaves, the black in the, in the window. So she wasn't quite so optimistic about my past as I was. Now, the other picture is a self-portrait. And now we don't know whether the cutoff point is is the page cut off or whether my feet are amputated. If the feet are amputated, it's not so good. However, she said the hands are a good sign, the fingers are intact, so that's very, very good. And that was, that was my. Oh, now the interesting thing is, as I said, with each child's picture, this goes into the into the book as well, was a little the impression. So the impression that whoever it was a teacher, I guess, had of me. She said, a very lively child, often outspoken. Now, interesting enough, the young archivist who showed me that, he said, in 1945, he said that was a veiled criticism. An outspoken child was not what you wanted. He said, today it's every parent's dream. That's what we all want, is outspoken children. So, there we go. That was one of the... Now, one more... let's see, what else can I... all right. I think I'm not going to get through everything that I had planned to do. I want to tell one wonderful story. When I was researching in the Geneva archives, where I found more material, both my parents' files and my own, and I found that this is where memory becomes so interesting. I had a memory of having spent a month in the mountains with a family. And I remember them quite well because they had a dog skin splayed against the fireplace. But they were very nice to me. But they weren't Jewish, and I felt quite alienated. But still, they were very kind to me. And anyway, I've written about it, so when the book comes out, you'll be able to catch up on this. But interestingly enough, when I went to the Geneva archives, I met with someone whose name was Ruth Fiva Silverman. She was a historian whose parents had been refugees. She herself stayed in Switzerland, became a historian at the archives, was given a very large grant. Switzerland wanted to redeem itself in the eyes of the world. They were giving grants to everyone. She got a very large grant to document the refoulement, the turning back at the borders. And her book just came out about half a year ago. And robots, thanks to the wonderful Wallfish, the librarian, has it, of course. So I just looked at it. in any case, she and I met, and we had prearranged to meet, and we were talking, and I took her to lunch, and after 2 glasses of wine, tongues loosened and so on, and I told her my story, that during the war, my mother had to, maybe I should read this. Well, no, I think let me just tell you. During the war, my mother had to have an operation. She had to have a goiter operation, which was a very typical Swiss thing. They all had goiter because of the altitude and because of the low iodine content. Anyway, my mother was not, she was supposed to have it in a small village near Morgin, where the camp was. My mother, didn't want it. She wanted to have it in Geneva, and she was quite right. So she found, she pushed her way. She got a reputation. I have this is all documented. The document says, Madame Jolis is very pushy. She wants to her way always. So my mother ends up coming to Geneva, and she needs a place for me to stay. Okay, to make it very, very short, this is a very charming story. It's too bad I have to be so brief. However, I stay with this family. They're Orthodox Jews, very volatile, and I love them, and I feel at home, and I'm crazy about them. And, they're always yelling, and this is it's great for me. Anyway, so my mother asks me if I want to stay. She's desperate. She's got to find a place for me. So I stay with them, and at some point, regularly actually, they would send me to play with their grandchildren, who lived in another part of Geneva, very Tony, and these children were treated like little jewels. They were like coddled eggs, I mean, everything was puddingy, and the mother washed them like little angels, Anyway, I remember them because their name, first of all, I remember them because they were, they stood out in my life, but also because their name was Finger, and I never forgot it. And the grandparents' name I had mixed up a bit, but the name Finger. So as I'm having lunch, and after 2 glasses of wine, I tell Ruth about this family that I knew, and the children who were my age, the girls. And I said, I'd give anything, I said, but how, that's the thing, being a refugee, you never run into somebody who knew you. So I'm sitting there, and she's listening. She's clearly a good historian. She listens carefully and so on. She said, well, I met somebody recently at a party whose last name was Finger. Her maiden name had been Finger, and I think her father had been involved in refugee work. So she said, call her up. Her name is Michelle Stroon. She's a publisher, very respected. She works out of Geneva and out of Paris. So give her a call. What have you got to lose? So of course this frightened me terribly. I thought, oh God, I'm not ready to do all this. But anyway, I called. It was Friday. Fortunately, she wasn't in. I was relieved. I thought, okay, it's good. Fate meant for me not to meet her. And the next day was Saturday. This is how history played. It was an anti-globalization day in Switzerland, in Geneva, and the press had talked about it was going to be a big, big thing. And I went down there, and I was a little bit too chicken-hearted to really participate, because I thought I don't want to get arrested. I'm in a foreign country. God knows what they'll do to me, and But I did take a lot of photographs, and as a result of that anti-globalization march, which were all women and children, and they're having a good time. I mean, they were not a danger to the Swiss economy at all, but the police were there in full gear with only little slits showing. Anyway, as a result of that, they had closed off many of the stores, and the one store that my mother and I used to go to regularly, my mother for some reason always needed little boxes. I don't know why. So we would go to this department store to have boxes, and I wanted to see it again. They used to have a slide going down. Anyway, there are all kinds of stories attached to this Grand Passage. So the name itself is so indicative and so metaphoric. By the way, I had a metaphoric angel overseeing my life that month, because everything I touched was metaphor. Anyway, I go into the one entrance that's open, because of the fear of the invasion of these demonstrators. The one entrance is the book entrance. So I'm looking, fairly casually. I didn't quite know what to do. And I come across books by this publisher, Metropolis. That's the name of the one that the woman that she had told me that could perhaps be somebody that I was referring to, this woman that I knew from, the time I was 6 years old, this Michelle Stroon. And I thought, all right, I look at what is she publishing? Well, a lot of women's liberation stuff from France, Jewish labor history, and the whole thing, it just seemed to me, this is incredible, that this woman should be publishing books that are central to my life, in Yiddish translations from the Yiddish. Anyway, I went, in those days you could smoke and drink everywhere in Switzerland. I'm sure you still can. I mean, here's this very sanitized country, but they're liberal about smoking. So I went, had a drink and so on. I began to think, I have to do something. This is too much of a coincidence. I went home to my lovely hosts, who were also Canadians, and they said, you got to call her, because I had her home phone. They said, this is the perfect time. In Geneva, no one eats dinner before 8. This is in Zurich, they do. You couldn't call, but here you can call. Give her a call, and what have you got to lose? So I call, and, they're cheering me on, and a man answers, and in my French, which is not as good as my German by any means, I, say who I am, but she doesn't know me, puts me on right away to, I knew the name, and she gets on the phone, and I say to her, were you named Finger during the war? And she said, yes. So at this point, she said, "You can speak English." I mean, yeah, she said, "Speak to me in English," because she had spent a lot of years in New York. So we started to talk. And so indeed she did not remember me, but she was the girl. I used to call them the girls with the curls because they had these beautiful curls, and I had straight hair, which I really bemoaned my fate about. Anyway, she said, "Come for coffee the next day." So this was it, and we fell in love. I mean, when I saw her at the elevator, all I could say was, "C'est vous." I mean, I would have, anyway, we've become very good friends. We see each other. Her sister lives around the corner from my daughter in New York, and she's going to publish this book. I mean, so in French. So we still need a, English version. So that's pretty much, I think, yeah. Now, any questions, comments? I'm happy, I'm here surrounded by.
Sit down.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure I've left out many important things.
Question.
Yes.
Could you say a few words if you knew Rebecca Fryer?
Fryer?
Yeah, Rebecca Fryer.
Yeah, she was the one who did.
She was an Orthodox.
Yeah, she saved a lot of. But she's a. Yeah, I do. There's a book called Rescue.
Yes.
I forget. I have it at home if you want to. Yeah, I think she deserves a great deal of credit because she took on a lot of the establishment and fought them and really fought them very hard. But her interest was essentially in saving Orthodox Jews, particularly rabbis, and she got them into China, into Shanghai, and so on. In other words, she did her good works, but it was a particular kind. Which, listen, I'm certainly not going to criticize. Yeah.
Was she from Hungary?
I think originally, but she had lived in, and then she came from a very prosperous family. I mean, and lived in Switzerland. Was very active and very.
No, she wasn't.
She was known, and she was very gutsy, and didn't take no for an answer. And and probably a lot of people's lives were. She arranged all kinds of things. She had very good connections everywhere. See, that's the thing. In Switzerland, you had connections if you were lucky. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's known that Jewish families, some Jewish families throughout Europe, had investments in Swiss banks.
Yeah.
And I wonder if any of those who were heading for Switzerland at that point were investors, and whether they withdrew funds or whether they had access to them, or how
Well, access, no. I'll tell you, the financial thing, okay, that's something I meant to speak about, but I didn't. The financial burden for the Jewish refugees in Switzerland was borne essentially by the Jewish community, both the Swiss Jewish community and the Joint Distribution Committee, which sent, Joint Distribution, I think they paid for about 50% of all the expenses. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars in those days. Now, there were when you came to Switzerland, by 1943, all funds were confiscated by the government, doesn't matter how, and put in escrow. In other words, they were put in trust, in trusteeship. They weren't stolen.
Even if they were from your account?
I don't know. I know with my parents, whatever money they had to be put into a trust. But yeah, but the other, I'm not that interested actually, but I think it is a big issue. The banks and so on, whether in fact people lost money or whether they, what the issues were.
Well,
the main thing is
the disgraceful part is
yeah.
that,
They didn't give money. Oh, yeah.
Survivors
Exactly.
knew their parents had funds.
That's right, and they couldn't get them
but
out.
They had to have death certificates.
That's right. It's from Auschwitz, right? Okay, and of course, several books have been written about. I forget. I mean, that's a fairly well documented issue. But the actual money thing, I don't know. I didn't spend too much time on that because I was much more interested in the sort of the daily life of, and that came much later. The whole issue on the Swiss banks. But it is true. Now, the Swiss were, really enriched by the war. I mean, everyone knows that. And when you say neutral, this is something I should have mentioned earlier. Switzerland is a neutral country, but the thing that is tragic is that they did not distinguish between war and genocide. So that's, that makes them really culpable. And that's something, we use the word neutral. We don't realize that it's one thing to be neutral in war, but this wasn't war, it was genocide. So the other thing that they had that only Jews had to do was a solidarity tax. If there were Jews who were well off, and of course everybody knew, I mean, they knew all your holdings, nothing could be kept secret. If they knew that you were a well-off Jew, you had to pay a tax, which was called a solidarity tax. Now, if this were true for all other refugees, it would be all right. It's not so terrible, but it was only the Jews that had to pay a solidarity tax. And so, I mean, that's not the worst of it by any means, so that's, yeah. No?
The other question is, do you know if the organization JIAS,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Studies, were they the ones that were...
No, that's not the joint, but JIAS was very good. HIAS it's called in some places, and JIAS here. In the States it's called HIAS. Yeah, HIAS was instrumental. The Jewish organizations were really, most of them, really wonderful. I mean, they worked miracles. I mean, that's how I came to, I still have that's how, one of the reasons I came to write this book. I was at the Joint Archives in New York, And so this is one of them. This was a memo that was sent in 1943, and it's called These Escaped, which is the name of the book that I'm doing. And it says the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, releases the names of 100 Austrian Jews who fled to Switzerland. So, you know, when you're a researcher, you look at everything. Every paper counts. And the first page, nobody. This is 50, 60 years later. And the next page is my family's name. So, but the Joint Distribution Committee did wonderful things. And don't forget, they had to work miracles in a sense, because once America entered the war, you couldn't send money directly from the United States. Switzerland was neutral, in quotes, right? They could get money from Germany, but not from the United States. So it had to be sent, it had to be laundered, it had to be sent from another country. So Portugal or Spain or something like that. So even sending money wasn't simple, but it was still done. Yeah. So Hashtag is Esther. Go ahead, please, yeah. Am I still? He died, unfortunately. We were in touch. He was an art teacher, very interested in art, particularly Canadian art, which he hadn't known too much about. So I remember I sent him some Canadian books on Canadian art. He was wonderful. He was very, very thrilled with it all. And then when he died, his daughter sent me a card telling me that when he was a camp director, the whole family lived in the camp. And so she remembered the children that she played with, some of whom eventually came to my camp, one of whom was my best friend. So he remembered everything. So meeting him was, he gave back a piece of my life to me, One hearing aid is missing.
I don't know whether you want to do this, but I think it would be lovely if we just crowded some small...
Yeah? Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to read one that's a little bit more lighthearted, okay? All right. In 1946, we switched, okay, I didn't mention this because I was just going too fast, I think. After the war, Morjan and a number of other camps closed down because it became uneconomical to run that many camps. So they sent refugees to various parts of Switzerland, and we landed in another camp, also beauty, also the hoteliers of Switzerland had provided us with great luxury, near Montreux. And magnificent. And this time we went to a public school, a country public school, which was not so nice. And we left the warmth and the shelter of this refugee camp. Don't forget, as a child, you don't really know that you're a refugee as such. You just know that you're surrounded by people who look like your parents, and they talk like your parents, and they're nervous like your parents, so that you feel very warm. The teachers are your friends. It's an integrated community. Suddenly we were sent to this other school, a country school. But anyway, we were there for a few months, and then eventually, as the war, 1946, the war is over. We thought the Messiah was coming. We were sure. We asked ourselves, because we really believed fervently that after the war the Messiah would come, but he tarried. So we were ending up in Geneva, waiting for the visa to come, that will eventually help us get to the United States, which my parents had applied for in 1938. So 9 years later. All right. Now, one of the things. So I went to a public school. This was a really wonderful, very sophisticated public school in Geneva, right near the university. And I'm sure Piaget's, his subjects must have come from that school. It was very sophisticated, very modern, very elegant. And Geneva was a magnificent city. We lived in the heart of it at that time. We rented a room from somebody. I mean, we didn't have a, palatial home. But anyway, I'll read a few things. Okay. Hygiene preoccupied the Swiss, and the school in Geneva reflected that concern. Periodically, we were examined for grooming and maintenance failures. Outbreaks of childhood diseases had been a constant reality in Morjan, and milder manifestations of communal living, such as impetigo, were ever present. Tincture of violet was the preferred treatment for this facial scab. Some child always bore that mark of camp life. I knew that in Geneva, such bodily violations would not be so easily indulged. One morning in the middle of the school year, Madame Maillard, our teacher, announced, "Today a nurse will be visiting our class on a health inspection." No explanation, no reason given for this interruption in our usual routine. I was sitting at my desk in a dreamy state and didn't immediately grasp her message. And then, alarm. What happened? Why a health inspection now? What would it mean for me? What would the nurse be looking for? Would we have to undress? A vaccination, maybe? I pictured a row of white uniformed nurses standing at the front of the room, needles in hand, ready to prick our arms, or worse, our bottoms. No escape seemed possible. Should I affect fainting? Perhaps I could sneak out undetected when I went to the toilet. These schemes were unlikely to succeed and might even cause greater problems than the health inspection. And what was I really afraid of? As these competing thoughts swirled through my mind, the door to our classroom opened. One woman entered, not the army I'd imagined. She wore dark blue skirt and blouse, altogether ordinary looking, all mediums, height, weight, hair color, and voice range. Madame Maillard asked us to come to the front of the room in pairs, beginning with the front row. My seat was in the last, allowing me a temporary reprieve. I watched as Jacqueline from the first row presented herself. She showed no signs of hesitation. I couldn't hear the instructions, but I saw Jacqueline extended both hands, fingers spread, to the nurse. That simple gesture of showing her hands sent a current of panic through me. I had warts on both my thumbs, and I pictured the scene when the nurse and the entire class would gasp in horror as they saw my thumbs. My row was called, and as I stood in line waiting my turn, touching my little growths, trying to rub them out, an intervention from above, a voice spoke to me. Deliver only 8 fingers, thumbs tucked under. I descended the evolutionary ladder. A rare moment of satisfaction swept over me as my pale growths went undetected and I passed inspection. I have a few more, but I think it's really getting, yeah, okay.